Hello, everyone. Welcome to that Early Childhood Nerd. I forgot the name of my podcast again. That is happening more and more regularly. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of That Early Childhood Nerd. Today, I've got Mike Huber and Richard Cohen. And as Richard just said, it's going to be like herding cats. So you can say hello if you want to say hello.
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 Okay, perfect. And so we're going to do an episode that I imagine is going to be mostly you two, and I'm just here giggling or nodding or saying, yeah. We're going to talk about men in early childhood. That's sort of the very narrow, I think, description of what we're going to talk about. That's maybe where this started. But we're going to talk about, I imagine you both are going to talk about your experiences and other things.
Maybe.
So
I noticed that you chose two men for this podcast. It kind of feels like reverse sexism or something. Isn't that a thing?
Yeah,
Tokenism.
absolutely.
I feel
Tokenism.
very, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it's my show, Richard.
Okay. All right.
So I demean who I choose. Okay, so the quote that we're going to start with is from a book called Beyond Quality in Early Childhood Education and Care, Languages of Evaluation by Gunilla Dahlberg, Peter Moss, and Alan Pence. And this comes from a chapter where they're discussing constructing the early childhood institution. What do we think they are for? And the quote is, early childhood institutions help to reproduce cultural values concerning gender. The highly gendered nature of the workforce in early childhood institutions and the lack of gender awareness in most pedagogical work produces a powerful discourse for children and indeed adults about appropriate gender roles and relationships. So I think this all sort of started with an article that we had all seen, or we're all talking about, lamenting the lack of men working in early childhood programs. And I know you two had a conversation without me, and it sort of evolved a bit from the original idea. So I'm going to just let each of you talk about what you want to talk about, and I'll chime in.
Well, we mainly talked about you, Heather. We never really got around to talking about the topic.
Yeah, oh, right, the article.
Right. Not Mike. No, I think I want to just kind of say one opener, and then I really want to hand it over to Mike, which is we really like this topic because, well, I'll just say for me, I really, the phrase that stood out for me was the phrase gender awareness, and how sort of vague and amorphous that is and open for many different definitions. And yet it really speaks to what Mike and I, the gist of our conversation. And so maybe, Mike, you could start by helping increase people's gender awareness, whatever that might mean.
Yeah, and it's funny because that was the first word I wrote down while Heather was talking. Like gender awareness, that's exactly it. Yeah, because I feel like people have a notion that, well, that there's a binary. That I'll start with that word, right? There are men and there are women. And even equating that with sex, and there's either XX chromosomes or XY chromosomes, and then say it's science. And of course it's not, right? So I'll talk about sex first. So sex being the physical or biological characteristics. There's one in, I have the page number. So I'm using my Supporting Gender Diversity in Early Childhood Classrooms book as my reference, because it is
very distracted by your nail polish.
Oh, it's the free sample I got for
your Color Street.
For Color
Street.
Street,
got your sample? I haven't gotten mine yet.
No, so right before, 2 hours before that email or whatever from Heather, a teacher that I a teacher that I supervise said,
because you're a coach.
You know what? I've been doing was it Street Color or whatever, and
Color Street.
Here's Color Street. Here's some free samples, and then I got that invite. And it's like, oh, well, I guess I'll find out more.
And get more free samples.
And more free samples. So the hard part is I only have 2 done on this.
You look cool.
Yeah.
Okay, well that's all I was going for.
Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah. What was I saying? Oh, so roughly 1 in 1,700 people, humans, don't have XX or XY chromosomes.
Right.
Some have X, some have XXX, some have XXY, some have XYY. So, and even the term sex chromosomes is not a scientific term. That was mainstream magazines trying to describe when they discovered the XX or the X chromosome and the Y chromosome.
Right.
And there's even in the paper, it said it is important not to refer to these as sex chromosomes because we don't know exactly what they, I don't know, genetic terminology. We don't know what things they may have the body do.
Right.
And yet, of course, by, the late 60s, everyone in school learns that there's XX chromosomes, there's XY chromosomes, and that tells you if you're a boy or a girl. So it was never science. It was textbooks trying to simplify things for high school students. and then we base everything on it, NACE included, in their what they describe as gender identity, or kids figure out that they're a boy at the age of 3, or figure out they're a girl at the age of 3, and then at 4 they figure out that they're going to be a man. If they're a boy, they'll be a man. If they're a girl, they'll be a woman. And they haven't updated that since. And of course, science has figured out lots of things. Your hormonal balance is different and doesn't always correspond to the majority of people in terms of what your chromosome makeup is. Your genitalia doesn't necessarily correspond to your chromosomes or to your hormones. There's lots of different things going on at once, and that's just sex. And then gender.
Wait, before we get to that, can I ask you a question, Mike?
Oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah. No, it's okay. You mentioned that sentence from NAEYC and how they framed it. So I guess my question to you, that children come to understand their gender at age 3 or 4, something like that, right?
Yeah.
So my question to you is, if you had the opportunity to rewrite that sentence for our field, what would be a better way of saying it? What do they discover at age 3 or 4?
Yeah. First of all, I would never want to be the one person, cis male, writing that sentence.
Yeah, I'm just curious for your perspective.
But if I was given the power and, being a white cis male, I probably should have that power just to
that was a joke.
Perpetuate.
Yeah. I was just going to say, so if we were all in a meeting together, Mike, how would you mansplain this to us?
Okay, there we go. Thank you. Now you're speaking my language. Well, Heather, what you don't understand is that gender identity is a much more complex thing, and that children begin to understand gender as soon as they begin to understand the difference between their body and someone else's and the rest of the world.
Right.
And it's a continuum, and it keeps evolving. For many people, what they've learned at 3, everything else that happens from that, or what at the age of 2, everything else builds off of that, seems to explain it.
Right.
But for some people, it doesn't. And for some people at the age of 70, they're still realizing new things about themselves, and that it's always a fluid thing. Gender is always a fluid thing, and it's a social construct. Getting nerdy here. That to explain how someone feels, and they can only use the language that exists at the time. So people my age often are like, what are these kids doing with 500 different identities? There can only be 4. And the generation before me is there can only be 2, and it keeps going. But the truth is those are just words and gender and social constructs to explain what's happening. And in a human being, there's a million things going on. The same way if we just say the word toddler and mean something, anyone who's worked with toddlers knows that doesn't explain, this kid. I have to get to know this child and everything about them. And gender is just gender's the same way. It's the label that we use for gender is just a word to try to get as close to possible to explain how we identify.
Well, our brains are sort of always trying to categorize and make things fit, right? So if the only file folders we have up there are male or female, that's where we're going to try and make everybody fit. So just by, just by learning more about the kinds of things you're talking about, Mike, we get more file folders.
Right.
Or we start to practice not messing with the file folders in our brain and just looking at what we've got
Right.
here around us.
Yeah.
Just
So I
to-
think that binary thinking sticks. It's almost like we've decided these are the only two terms we're using, and then it's like I always describe it as to parents who are first finding out that their child identifies as trans, that the child already knows, and the child's always been right. We used to think that adults knew better, and we'd say, no, the child is mixed up. The child is, and using those statements from NACE and other child development statements, don't have to just put them under the bus. Teachers and parents would be told, oh yeah, you just need to help your child, give him more trucks and he'll realize he's a boy.
Oh God.
Or whatever, all these crazy things. And of course, it turns out that it's not that simple, and that the adults are the ones that just need to do more listening, like much of child development.
Yes.
Right. What I would add in, just as kind of an umbrella statement for any listeners who are new in their understandings of child development, and either of you, please tell me if I'm not accurate in the way I'm about to say this.
Okay.
But what children do come to in terms of cognitive development, what children are able to do by ages 3 or 4 is they begin to start noticing human differences and differentiating things in the world. So by 3 or 4, they start to realize people have different eye shapes and hair textures and skin colors and different, I don't want to say reproductive parts. What do we call those things down there? Different genitalia.
Genitalia.
Yeah. So they do start to become aware and notice those differences. And where NACE and those other organizations sort of get it wrong is they frame it as something bigger than just differences in anatomy.
Yeah, and differences in, because anatomy in general, I feel like that's what a child who's in maybe a biracial adoption or, cross interracial adoption where they're a different race than their parents. At 3, they start to notice, wait, I'm different. What does that mean?
Right.
How, they're trying to make sense of the difference between their physicalness and other people's physicalness, whether it's genitalia or skin color, eye shape, etc. So yeah, I think for sure it's kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
I just think our society puts, sort of sex in this box, and we, our pronouns are based on our gender. So therefore, we have to know what gender the person is. God forbid, someone sees a toddler with long hair and says, oh, she's so pretty, and finds out it's a boy, and then is worried, not that they just use the wrong pronoun, but they use the word pretty to describe a child.
And that somehow
because it's not the society.
Yeah.
Yes.
My son had long hair most of his life.
Because
he got that all the time.
In a patriarchal, misogynistic society, right? The idea of being equated with a female we have in our heads is an insult.
Insult, yes.
Right? So this idea that a boy could be pretty or someone with long hair is accidentally called a girl, and that's an insult, is rooted in misogyny, sexism, and patriarchy.
Yeah.
But I digress.
The trifecta. Misogyny, sexism, patriarchy.
Yes, and you need someone other than Mike and I on your show to talk about those topics.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it does bring up
from the binary later. But Mike, I interrupted you earlier, just like I did now, because that's what I do. Hey, by the way, I learned this week that that's called cultural overlapping, and that's part of my Jewish heritage. It's not interrupting.
That you interrupt? Oh, it's cultural overlapping.
Yeah. So
thank you for mansplaining that for us.
You're welcome.
Richard's the best.
No, that wasn't mansplaining because
I do explain it for you. But earlier, like around one of the first times I interrupted you, you were going into 2 different parts around gender.
Are you trying to bring him back to it?
Getting to the second part.
Yeah.
Okay.
So gender identity. So I was talking about biological sex. And then I was saying that there's also a thing called gender. And so gender and sex are 2 different things. And, the Supreme Court had to, review. So even the Supreme Court now realizes that the term gender means what sex meant back in 1968 or whenever that act was written.
Right.
Right. And so the split, and I think Gail Rubin is mostly attributed with having that split in the 1970s. She realized there's something about gender. There's something that's about how you identify and who you are that is different than the biological sex. There have been people who did not match those two as far back as we can find, right? So it's not that that wasn't there, but she was the one who came up with the term for it, gender identity. And since then, people started to realize from there, it's like, okay, so if it's a gender identity, now there's transgender. Before then the only term people used was transsexual or cross-dresser to mean all sorts of things. So that idea of gender is who you identify as. A lot of times people think of it as the brain, right? Who you feel you are, think you are. There's lots of evidence that the hormonal balance in your brain corresponds closer to the gender that you feel you are. Anytime we talk about gender and get into binary, it's hard because study after study shows that there are more similarities between people from different genders and different sexes than there are that separate the two, right? So you're always going to find people that don't fit any of this. So I'm trying to not use binary language as I talk about this also, but gender identity is who you identify as, regardless of what your chromosomes are, regardless of what your genitalia is, regardless of your hormones. Although actually the more studies show that hormones might have a bigger part in this than the other things. So gender identity is something that people have, and there are studies of transgender adults. Almost everyone interviewed talks about they knew who they were. They knew what gender they were at the age of 3, but maybe brought it up once, got the reaction from their parents and never brought it up again. And then, and some, especially from the older generation, is that a polite way to say it? There's plenty of people who are, coming out as trans in their 60s, 70s, because it's finally, they're finding, oh, I can actually say this now. I can actually talk about this now. And this is something I always knew. And I thought there was something wrong with me. And now I'm realizing, no, there was something wrong with society. Right. So gender identity is a separate thing from sex. And the rest of society wants to be able to tell you who you are rather than the person whose identity it is. I guess I mean.
Yeah, I think that's great.
I could spend a few hours describing it in more detail, but.
Well, I'll take this rare moment of you not speaking, Mike, and jump in. Oh, you said that often what happens is young children will tell them and then it gets dismissed, right?
Yeah.
But also just for all of us to remember that young children often don't tell us, they show us in the ways they behave. So a boy will go to pick up a doll, a girl will go to kick a soccer ball, and then they'll be told, oh, no, that's not for you, right?
Or they'll get the other reaction, a boy picking up a doll, and everybody fawns very dramatically.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so cute.
Yes.
Oh my gosh. Oh, look at that. Like either way, it's showing there's something wrong with this.
Right.
Right. And when you put it into the context, of our larger society, right? I want to point out that this topic is really powerful for so many people. They have so much energy attached to the subject of gender. We just saw it in the news. We're recording this in late February.
Yep.
Literally in the House yesterday, one of the representatives, Marjorie Taylor Greene, posted a sign that said there are only 2 genders, male and female, in her office.
And then something about science.
Yeah.
Like we believe science.
Right. So this thing about gender, people have strong opinions about it. And it's important to notice that and get curious about why that might be so. How did we end up here such in this world where we have so much energy
Mhm.
attached to the subject of gender.
Mhm.
Because once you start getting curious about that, you start really looking back into history and understanding. And when you to go toward kind of my next point, when you start looking at binary thinking and you start to notice it all over the place, not just with gender, right? You start to realize that I'll speak for me. I started to notice that human beings aren't born thinking black, white, right, wrong, yes, no, boy, girl, but we are enculturated to think in that way. From our earliest days, the grown-ups around us tend to think in that way, this or that. And so that's what we pick up on very early.
Right.
And so one of the things that I try to teach people is to think along a spectrum instead of notice when you're thinking, this is the bad child, this is the good child in my class. This is a desirable behavior, that is an undesirable behavior. Notice when you start thinking that way and start to look for the grays in the middle and think along a spectrum, and it opens up so many more opportunities for how to help those children or solve problems or just get through life. When you start to notice that you and everyone around you only tends to think in one or the other, in binary thinking.
Right. And I think that often comes up in the classroom as either typical versus atypical, or the challenging child and the whatever. No one would say good child, but
Well, some
but that's
do.
what they mean. Well, yeah, okay, sorry. Some do. No one would say, where I work as a supervisor, no one would say it in front of me.
Right. That's because they're scared of you because you're a man.
That's right. That's right. But it does bring up that idea that, yeah, it either has to be this or that. I had a parent once whose child in my classroom did great, goes off to kindergarten, is having trouble. Special ed is referred. They're thinking maybe it's ADHD. They're waiting for a diagnosis. And the teacher asked her, "Did you get a diagnosis yet?" And she said, "No." And she said, "Oh, because, let me know, because then I'll know what strategies to use." And I love that she said this to him. She said, "What if you just treated every child in your classroom like they have ADHD?"
Right.
Which is kind of what my classroom was when I had my own classroom. Well, I shouldn't say it that way. There was definitely plenty of room to be quiet, to do different things. But if you needed to, jump around or wrestle with somebody, you could do that at except for nap time, I guess. There was a space to do that, right? That I assume that people have needs, and they can, if you give them access to meet those needs, they'll do that, whether they're 3 or 53.
Yeah.
So that's another thing about the human mind. In addition to tending to think binarily, it also craves labels, or as Heather spoke about earlier, folders. It makes life easier from our roots as members of the animal kingdom, when you can quickly say, this is this or this is that, it's safe or it's not safe. And so, can you please tell me if the child has ADHD or not? Because once I know, I can enact these strategies. But when you start realizing that the logic in that is so off from what's actually real, then you start to say, well, I actually need to give all children supports, because one of the great things and the biggest challenges of being in early childhood education is we're with many children before they get those labels. We're with so many kids who it's not until long after they leave us that someone else says, this child has ADHD, this child has a hearing problem, this child is not neurotypical or whatever. And so in our world, we have to just assume everyone has something going on, individualize what we're doing, and give them all the supports they need, not wait for the label to do it.
Yeah, and that we have such a hard time. My center is a inclusion center, and we get some county funding, and trying to track who are the kids that we're getting funding for.
Right.
So for them, we have to define it. And so we have these sort of definitions of, here's the kids that teachers seem to need help figuring out. And here's the ones that actually qualify for the funding.
Right.
But how do we use that funding then to pay for helping teachers with all the children? Because again, yeah, like insurance definitely wants a definition,
right.
Diagnoses in that case. Yeah, and Stephen Jay Gould, I will say, has the best essays on this. I can't just pull them up out of my brain right now, but just talking about science in general, the science of labeling things is only there to help frame your thinking, but they shouldn't create new thinking, right? That you can't. And the example he used was somebody said back in the 80s, talking about, well, at least now legalizing marijuana will only be the stuff of, or no, legalizing drugs will only be the stuff of cocktail party chatter. And he said, kind of interesting because people are drinking a drug, but you're saying that it's, you know, not okay. And also, of course, history has proven them wrong that, but it just took a few decades. But just that idea that once you say that there's drugs and there's alcohol, now, you know, there's no basis in reality for saying one isn't a drug. My father, who was an alcoholic, would always say that, like would worry about his kids doing drugs. And we're just like, Dad, you were always drunk. It's like, well, that's different.
Right, right.
Not to get into personal matters here, but can you now be my therapist for the next hour?
Sure.
Weren't we already?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay, fine.
So can I ask you to extend the conversation about moving away from non-binary thinking to this conversation that the field is having now about needing more men working in childcare programs or early childhood programs?
Well, Heather, let me mansplain this for
Yeah,
you.
would you please?
We can't stop thinking about binary thinking when we're thinking about teachers, because saying that we need more men because we only have women, I think it's too simple of a thought, and too often then the things I read will be these, oh, make it more welcoming to men, you know, make whatever, like make sure that the talk you have in the break room or whatever is open to men. And I'm thinking, I bet there's plenty of women who could care less about what people are talking about at work and just want to talk about, you know, the UFC match last night or the whatever. And then there's other, you know, then there's going to be men who want to talk about, you know, the nail party or whatever. Like it's more about having a diversity of people and figuring out you're being inclusive for all types of staff members, regardless of gender. I shouldn't say regardless, with them aware, sorry, that's what I should say, awareness of their gender and awareness that there might be some things you don't know. Same thing when a staff member comes in and they're using a wheelchair. You might not know what they need, but you also shouldn't assume they need something, right? That it's more about getting to know the person and be inclusive with whoever's there. And I think the binary thinking that, okay, now it's a man coming in, so we have to do this. Let's put up a, I don't know, a football poster. I don't know what you would do for men feeling welcome.
Well,
But,
so
yeah.
much of it comes from what the things that I've read, comes from this idea that boys are hard to handle. And so we need to bring in men to get them under control. What?
And to model for them.
And to model for them.
What appropriate male behavior looks like.
Right. But so I think, you know, in actuality, we could be talking about active children need teachers who understand and accept and provide for that kind of play, and not necessarily we need more penises in here.
Right. Yeah, we can save that for my apartment. No.
Wait, what?
Yeah, I'm not dismissing it.
There's
a time and place for more penises.
And this was not it, Mike. So
sorry.
What I would add to that is I was telling you the other day, Mike, about when I was a young preschool and kindergarten teacher. And of course, the only male in the school, that was in the late 80s, early 90s. And the waiting lists to get into my class were so long. Every mom, particularly moms of boys, and subset of that, particularly divorced moms or single moms, wanted their children in my class because they felt that their children lacked a male figure in their lives, and that my gender could.
You were going to macho them up?
Right. And hello, it's me. That wasn't going to happen. So, at the beginning of the year in the open house, I would say to them, now I'm aware that a lot of you are in this class, I suspect, because of my gender, and you thought that that was going to be my biggest contribution to your child. But I want to talk a little bit more about how we're going to learn through play and how I'm going to facilitate your children's learning and how I'm not going to be teaching them their letters, numbers, colors, and shapes, because that's probably more critical to you. That's going to have more of an impact on your child's life than my gender. So it's not too late to switch classes. It's really important you understand my philosophy of this classroom, because that's more important than my gender. And if that doesn't work for you, I understand the teacher across the hall has got 3 more slots in her classroom.
And at the same time, to not think binary about this, the representation is important. I think of my own child was in my preschool, and one of the teachers was non-binary. I had to make up a name quickly, so we'll call them K. And whatever, and Kay actually would sometimes be a babysitter as well for my child. But then when my child was 10, they suddenly started asking me, so remember that teacher Kay? They use they as their pronoun, right? And so, yeah. And we talked about it. It's like, oh, okay. And then the next day they're asking about him. And it's like, okay, you're 10. Why are you, how is this coming up? And finally said, yeah, I think and they had some gender neutral. That was the term my child used at the time, having not looked through the internet for other terminology, but immediately found the one term that they've seen, gender. Oh, I'm gender neutral too, just like Kay. And so that representation was important. And I think, Heather, your conversation about tattoos, that teachers should be able to show their tattoos, because that type of representation is important. So it's not the only thing about a person. It's not the defining thing about a person. And I think that's important, that people shouldn't choose a classroom just because of that representation. And yet it's also important to have a diverse staff. So, which goes right back to your question, Heather, of how do we get more men in early childhood? And I think Richard had it with, was it the patriarchy?
What was it? Sexism, patriarchy, and misogyny.
Yeah, there we go. Well, that's the problem. When it's a low paying field with low status, not that, I almost feel like the way to get men involved is to talk about the equity lens and how this is a great way to make the world more equitable and things, and you'll attract the right men. You might not get the man who's like, well, yeah, but I want to be the one in charge.
Yeah.
The other piece to that, though, is, again, everything we do in our field exists we're just a subculture of human culture, right?
Yeah.
So it's important to notice that men and women, boys and girls, are raised in a society still where we're taught that men should be the primary breadwinners in the family. And so when males feel that that's their responsibility, I've heard this too many times, they'll say, I can't get into early childhood because I've got to make the money. And that's the reason for not doing something their heart is drawn to.
Yeah.
But I want to go back really quickly, Mike, for a minute.
Yeah.
Because not everyone listening to this podcast may know all the terms that we 3 are comfortable with and throwing around so easily. So could you used a term earlier, could you define it for people? Non-binary, what does that mean?
So non-binary is sort of an umbrella gender identity term, but basically means the person does not identify as a man or a woman, male or female. There's lots of other terminology that people use to be more specific about it. Non-binary tends to be the term used just in the general public, but then when they're, say, on dating apps or something, they might be even more specific and use terms such as demigirl or things where it gets a little more defined, or, being masculine presenting and things like that, there can be more detail, but non-binary just simply means the person is not identifying as one of the 2 genders that Representative Green, is that her name?
Yes.
Would tell you about.
Right.
So, and people who identify as non-binary frequently use they, them, singular, as their pronouns.
Right.
And that also seems to really upset people. People who use the pronoun you to mean both just you, Heather, and you as in Heather and Richard. Yeah, use it singular and plural all the time. But they, that's where we cross, that's fighting words there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Heather, what's been your experience of men in early childhood?
Very limited. I mean, I have
You and Mike, is that it?
no. When I was a center director, I had one. Well, I had a couple men who worked for me, and they identified as male. So I feel like I can say they were men working for me, and they were fine. It was just another staff member, but parents were really like, I had parents request that the man not ever change a diaper or not ever be alone. And that really wore on both of them, that just knowing that there were people that they wanted to have a trusting relationship with who were looking at them with suspicion. I had another one who, just like you were talking about with the little boy who chooses a doll and everybody fawning over him. I've seen that too with men who work in childcare. You're this special kind of unicorn, and it's so wonderful that you're choosing this, which sends a message, a sort of an unconscious message or an implicit message. Is that what I want to say? That there is something weird about it. Even though we're praising him for it, it's still a little weird.
And I think I think part of it is because people aren't explicit. Like if someone just said, I haven't met a male preschool teacher before or toddler teacher, whatever, that is honest and can be disarming. But to just sort of, oh, it's so nice to meet you, it's so good to see you here, doesn't feel genuine, because then it is the tokenism, right? They're only seeing my one thing about me.
Right.
They're not saying it's so great to see you here because you think that play is the best way for children to learn. You don't think it's great that I'm here because I know a lot of songs to sing with kids. It's, again, going back to like, oh, there's a penis in the room. Right? Like it just...
How wonderful.
How wonderful. And if they would just say that, that would get really weird.
Yeah, that might be weird.
It already did.
Yeah.
That ship has sailed, Mike.
But I think just being able to say, I haven't experienced, and it's the I statements too, right?
Yeah.
Oh, I haven't worked with someone from, West Africa before. If we're talking too fast, if there's things you need, because like I tend to talk fast and interrupt people when it's an English language, English is their third or fourth language. People are often like, whoa, wait, what did you say? Can you slow down?
Yeah.
And I can slow down for about 2 minutes before I speed up again. But being aware of that, that's something that with the particular teacher I was thinking of, that was what she needed mostly,
Right.
Other than that, and she also wouldn't, she had a way of like not directly in meetings, had a hard time with our American style of bringing things up right in front of everyone. And so I've learned that the next morning I had to go into her classroom before things started. And then she would tell me what she was thinking. And then we'd bring it back. And it was a teacher collective. We were a hippie center, like everybody knew that was going to happen. They'd wait to kind of, and then it's, okay, do you want to tell everyone? Do you want me to tell everyone? But we had to create a different way of discussion because the rest of us grew up in America and we're used to like, you talk and the person who lasts the longest essentially made the decision. And is anyone else arguing with you at the end?
We mentioned earlier, that tends to be males.
Yeah.
Who will out-talk anyone to have the last word.
Are you trying to contradict us, Heather? I see that look.
Why are you looking at us, Heather, when I say that?
Because you're the only two on my screen to look at. But
All right.
also, I feel like I could out-talk whoever I'm in the
like
meeting
what?
with. I could out-talk whoever I'm in the meeting with.
That's true. You can.
Well, see, here it is. We shouldn't have the binary. It's not all men
Yeah.
who can outtalk, and it's
Yeah.
not always men who can outtalk.
Yes, I've often been told I'm a special case. So maybe that's what it is.
Well, I do have to say, my partner mentioned recently, like, why is it early childhood podcast? There's so many men. Like, if there's no men in the field, why
are they all doing the
podcasts?
podcast? Well, that's a question.
And I think it's about the talking thing that men tend to be, oh, everyone should hear what I have to say.
Uh-huh.
I clearly feel that way, which I hate to admit, but it's true. I don't need everyone to agree with me, but I feel like,
you should all hear me.
So I want to go back for just a moment and just follow up on Heather's anecdote about the men you worked with.
Yeah.
Just because it happened to me too, and I thought I'd share that so that your listeners know it's not just the one time in Heather's world, that it happens all the time. So when I was a young teacher, it happened to me twice. In the beginning, I was going to college and taking classes in the morning, and then I was a half-day teacher, infant, toddler, preschool in the afternoons, and then waiting tables at night. And I got to work one day, and the director sat me down and said, well, this thing happened. You weren't even here when it happened. But two of the toddlers were in the bathroom and they played I'll Show You Mine If You Show Me Yours. And so we're having an emergency parent meeting because the parents are flipped out that it happened. And we just think until the storm blows over, it would be best if you didn't change any diapers.
Oh boy.
You weren't even there. It has nothing to do with you. But because you're a man, let's keep you from changing diapers for a while. Actually, it happened to me 3 times. And then fast forward another year, that was in St. Louis. Then in Los Angeles, again, I was going to Pacific Oaks, came to work, I don't know, later in the day or a different day, and got taken aside by the boss who said, yesterday in the kindergarten classroom, not even yours, 2 kids were playing I'll Show You Mine If You Show Me Yours. Actually, they took aside me and the other male who was the gym teacher.
Yeah.
And they said, for the time being, we're going to ask you not to have children sit on your laps until this blows over. Okay. Now, fast forward to 2019. After all my years in these big leadership positions, I finally had the chance to go back and be a preschool teacher again in St. Louis when I went back there because my mom was sick and I moved back home. And I thought, this is going to be great. I'm going to be a preschool teacher again. And before the school year ever started, the directors introduced me to the rest of the staff in our pre-service training. I was one of 3. We were a trio of teachers in the preschool room, in the pre-K room, me and 2 young women. And they said, this is Richard. He's our new preschool teacher, but don't worry, he won't be changing any diapers.
Oh, God.
He's a man. And my 2 co-teachers were like, wait, what? Are you kidding me? We're going to have to change all the diapers? And I was like,
yeah, and they're looking at you like, you
Yeah.
jerk.
Yeah.
well, and she had just gotten through telling all of us how she is a huge feminist and that is her big passion in life is women's rights. And I was like, okay, so you missed a step in there somewhere.
Yeah. Women
Why-
have the right to
I
change
literally
all the
wrote the 8
diapers.
steps to diaper changing,
Mhm.
that we put out from DC, from NACRA.
Mhm,
You're going to not have me change diapers? What?
right.
So I immediately started
Yeah.
looking for another job and quit
Yeah.
there.
And I'm going to throw in one story too, even though it clearly that's plenty of evidence, but I had a,
And it,
I don't know, one of the coolest things in my career really was one time this teacher applied to be, well, I guess a substitute. He had just finished his associate's degree, but he is someone I taught as a preschooler.
Oh my goodness.
And actually, like, parents keep telling me that there's a lot of kids that I taught that went into teaching of some sort.
Awesome.
I also had a special ed, someone who came in as a coach from the school district, special ed coach, and it was someone I taught also. And she took some special attention when she was a preschooler too. No, but this young man just got his associate's degree, started working with the kids. And the kids would do what kids do, of sort of like, when he'd walk by, they'd like spank his butt and say something. And he didn't know how to react because he was too worried that people would think that he was trying to get them to do, whatever. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know what I mean? And he also didn't want to come out as too harsh, like being like the angry man or whatever,
Yeah.
like, and I was just switching jobs. So I saw him start. And then like a month later, the director, called it, Mike, could you come in and just talk to him? Because he's really feeling like he's just going to leave the field. And so I came in like 2 different times to try to like coach him about, how to let kids know your boundaries without being explosive, but also, just doing that. And it happens to everybody.
Mhm.
I couldn't honestly say that other people aren't going to view that as different than if they did it to a female teacher.
Mhm.
But, he was what, 20, 21. He was totally new to the field.
Right.
He was still trying to figure out that balance of how you do get kids to do what you want without, whatever, you don't get walked over, but you don't,
Yeah.
like scream at them. And he couldn't, I'm pretty sure he left. I actually don't know.
Mhm.
It's been a few years now. I don't know if he
Hmm.
ever went back, but yeah, it happens. And of course, the person who's teaching knows that there's perceptions too. So that
Sure.
makes it hard.
Yeah.
I want to make sure we actually talk about your question though.
Okay.
At some point in here. Well, I think all this is part of your question.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
I think so.
But I feel the other part is, that men who go into the field do have to take some responsibility too. Yes, there's going to be that perception. But also I feel like men do want to be the center of the universe often. Here I am getting all binary and explaining
I know.
men is one thing. But I feel like in our society, people would always take my idea seriously.
Yes.
Right. And so even like when I went into early childhood, been in the field 3 years and people are asking me my opinion on something. Now, part of it is I was a nerd and read a lot and stuff,
Yeah.
but still it's like, there's people around here who've been working with kids longer than me, but making sure that I'm heard. And even though some of my ideas are a little stretching ECE with rough and tumble play and all that,
Uh-huh.
it's still like, I know people are going to listen to me. And honestly, when I first started doing it, I made sure I didn't wear nail polish and I wore like, business attire as I'm telling people
Man clothes.
crazy things, man clothes. Yeah, essentially drag for me. And as I got more confident in my message and people, I had a book and things, so I could, then I worried less about that. But there is something when you go into a field and everyone else, you're the only man in the room and you've been used to people listening to you. Like, you got to get used to like, not every, you don't have the floor all the time. And there may be a meeting where you don't say anything the entire meeting.
Wow.
I know, which admittedly didn't happen to me in other worlds, So I think that's the other thing. Like the other side of it is that the way culture, men are prepared not just to be the breadwinner, but also that they're the one always listened to, and and even that it's a sign of leadership to make sure your voice is heard in a meeting.
Right.
And so I think that's another thing that's important.
What, Richard?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just saying, I'm really glad you brought that up, Mike, because I can imagine some of Heather's listeners listening to this or watching the video podcast and saying, oh man, a couple of white males whining about how hard it is for them. And, yes, you weren't allowed to have kids sit on your lap and you couldn't change diapers. But I just want to be really clear that, although we mentioned some downsides or whatever, some cautionary tales about being a male in our field, it lives within this greater culture where our privileges are so deeply ingrained and so powerful that, I just want to make sure we acknowledge that, the power that we have. And also just to sort of validate what you said, I noticed it too over the course of almost 40 years now. I would be in many conversations, even in like these large national and international leadership, early childhood leadership organizations. I was still the only man around the table, but it was weird. When I would say something, everyone would be quiet and listen. And more often than not, they'd go, oh yeah, let's do what he says. And I started like noticing that and like, is that my gender? What why is everyone according me with that? I think it's because we're all trained to think the man knows something.
Mhm.
And I would have to very explicitly interrupt that in groups I was
Yeah.
in, because we're only going to come up with better solutions if we're hearing diverse opinions. Don't just go with mine because I'm the male, even if you're only doing that on a subconscious level. Let's cut that out,
Mhm.
you know? Heather, do we have time for me to go down one other related tangential rabbit hole?
You're the one on the time schedule today.
That's true. I know you hate editing these into 2 parts, but I think we've passed that
Yeah.
point. Well, we talked about gender or sex, and we talked about gender identity. But to further complicate things, then there's a related topic of sexual orientation, which is different than gender,
Uh-huh.
right? But it has meant that my experience has been quite different from many of my straight male early childhood colleagues, because that comes into play, right? Is sexual orientation.
Mhm.
And so one thing I've noticed over the 40 years is that when I was a young teacher, of course, this was in the late 80s, early 90s. And when I was openly out about being gay, it was at the height of the AIDS epidemic. And also, you know, I would like to hopefully say toward the end of centuries of the pedophilia mythology that being homosexual means you're a pedophile. And so I was hyper aware of those concerns. And I would address them straight up with my families in that open house. And I would just say, the most important thing is that when you leave your children to go to work every day, you can concentrate on your job and focus because your children are safe in my care. So as awkward as this is going to be, and you're going to hate it, I'm going to go around and look each of you in the eye, and I want you to know I am not a pedophile.
Oh, boy.
And it would freak people. Oh my God, Richard, we never thought that about you. I know.
Yeah.
But subconsciously, in case it's there, I wanted to just say it so you can
Mhm.
sleep
Mhm.
easily knowing. Now, the next thing is we have to build trust so you can trust what I just said. But I wanted to at least put that out there.
Hmm.
And now what I notice in more recent years, particularly in my last role as a director, and my straight male staff, they're the ones now. This is just my anecdotal, what I noticed. I don't know that there's statistics around it, but it seems like nowadays gay males are in early childhood are less suspect, and people are tending to be more nervous about straight males changing diapers and all of that. And I'm not quite sure what that means or how it happened. It's just something I think I noticed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm glad
there's
you
another
shared.
rabbit hole.
I'm not making fun of you. I just had
Okay.
a brain spasm or something. What did you say, Mike?
Oh, I was going to say well, no. But one thing that it brings up for me is just that idea that I think that people in any sort of gender minority or sexual minority already break the sort of notions of what being masculine is and things. So I
Mhm.
think, in some ways, I feel like our field has more men in the field who are gay than in the general population, right?
Mhm.
Because it's sort of like those men are more likely to sort of, like, I already threw out some ideas of, what society thinks men should do. But because I think there's plenty of straight men who would also care for kids and also want to be in that, but at the same time are worried about the perception of what they're doing and from a personal level. And again, that's where I feel like men just need to get over it, right? That's one side of it, is men just need to get over that. And like, yeah, you can care about kids, and caring for kids. I just have to, this is kind of a rabbit hole, but we won't go down there because Heather and I have had this conversation that rough and tumble play is a form of caring. And that whether it's a man doing it, a woman doing it, someone who's non-binary, whoever is roughhousing with kids, that's caring for kids because it's healthy for kids. It helps with their social skills. it's fun, it's joyful.
It meets a need that they
It meets a
have.
need.
Yeah.
And sometimes there's that perception too, right? That if you play rough with kids, it's not not caring, that there's like this caring side, and that's what women do. And then there's this, discipline side or something, that's what men do or something. And I think once you can break that binary, like men, it's easier for men to be in the field if they aren't thinking in those terms. And it's easier if, women, again, we have to smash the patriarchy for all this. I know,
Right.
But part of it is that notion. And I feel like the people who do get into the field, tend to be people who have at least broken that notion, whether it's because their sexual orientation sort of forced them to do that, because they're either going to hate themselves or they're going to see society as wrong, but straight men could certainly do the same thing, right? That realize, oh, I don't have to be whatever, the tough guy, or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, I want to mansplain what this dude just said. Because
now you're just gay splaining.
Huh?
Now you're just gay splaining.
I want to gay. No, it really is more. I don't know. It's person splaining. I don't know.
Person.
But anyway, when Mike and I talked about this very topic the other day before to prepare for, we were supporting each other on how to deal with Heather, and we knew it was going to be tough.
It's tricky,
But the way you said it the other day, Mike, really resonated with me, which was, we're here to meet children's needs. We're here to observe them, build relationships with them, and give them what they each individually need, which can change from moment to moment or day to day. So if you're seeing that a child wants to rough and tumble play, that's why you respond in that way. And that's why it's an expression of caring. And you don't just rough and tumble every kid. You see who wants or needs that, and then that's what you give them out of your care.
Yep. And the kid who wants to play with the doll, you make sure they have enough dolls, and you play with them.
And you play with them with dolls.
Right. And it regardless of gender. And the same is true, that women could also roughhouse with, because I think that's a bias, I think in our field, that's not necessarily gender related. I think a woman roughhousing, the other teachers would also say, hey, that's too rough.
Sure.
Well, and I think the other way to get out of the binary on this topic is to just frame it around consent.
Yeah.
It's really, it doesn't matter for you, the teacher, what your gender or gender identity is. It's about modeling for children and teaching them that, no one gets to touch you unless you say it's okay. So if I'm going to roughhouse with you, I'm always going to ask you first. And I love you whether you say yes or no. So.
And tickling is a type of roughhousing or rough and tumble as well.
Yeah, so we'll just take this minute to remind people that Mike has an article about consent in preschool from a past issue of Exchange.
We did do an episode.
We did an episode.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
And if you want to hear me talk more about it, come to my living room.
There's a pandemic, Richard. No one's coming to your living room.
Call me.
Yeah. Well, I think we should wrap this up. I know, Richard, you've got to get on the road anyway. But this was great. I know we could have gone on and on, so maybe there'll be a follow-up episode at some point. I've made a list of things I want to get back to with you guys, either recorded or not recorded.
Note to nerd listeners.
Yeah.
Heather always loses her lists.
That's true.
So don't get your hopes up that we're going to come back to anything on her list.
God damn it, Richard.
Or if we say we're going to talk about it, we might talk about something else.
Right. That might be the first 10 minutes of the episode, and then it's all over the place. Also, I need to mention that I bought that book you were using, Mike, while you guys were talking.
Oh, perfect.
So that this has been a very constructive, productive recording session for me. All right. Thank you both for straightening me out when I had the initial idea and you thought it could go deeper, but also just for taking time to talk about this and to help me understand some of it. And I know the listeners will get a lot out of it too.
I've never straightened anyone out in my entire life.
And I would think less of you if you did. So,
all right, fine.
this is fun though.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to hit end here because Richard's got to get on the road.
Bye, everyone.
So thanks
Bye.
for being here both. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you again on another episode.